You are now listening to Mark's Unexplained World by Mark the Medium. Available on Apple Podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon Prime, Podbean and most other podcast platforms. Tonight's episode is about the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. So it's over to you now, Mark, for this week's crazy episode.
The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which was also known by other names such as the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane and Weston State Hospital, was a psychiatric institution located in Weston, West Virginia, in the United States, and was open to patients from the October of 1864 until the May of 1994. It was originally designed and built to accommodate 250 patients. However, by the 1950s, it became overcrowded and ended up incarcerating around 2,400 inmates. A 1938 report by a survey committee organised by a group of North American medical organisations found that the hospital housed amongst its population epileptics, alcoholics, drug addicts and mental defectives who were found to be incapable of being educated. The survey committee also found that due to the lack of proper care at Trans-Allegheny and the poor access to any sanitation, this led to a large number of deaths, and although the official count of patients who died at the asylum is not available, research is currently underway to determine a more accurate figure, with the Weston State Hospital expert and historian Titus Swan estimating the number to be on or above the 5-figure range. After the hospital's closure in the May of 1994, in the March of 2008, it was reopened as a tourist attraction. Greetings, Unexplainers. Thank you for tuning in once again and listening to this lunatic fringing episode of Mark's Unexplained World. My name is Mark Hughes. I am a medium, a ufologist, a true crime buff, a man with a very dark and disturbed sense of humour who can tell when people are being judgmental just by looking at them. But to give you a better idea of who I am and what I do, every week, usually on a Tuesday night, though occasionally on a Wednesday allowing for bank holidays and busy weekends, I do a podcast on the many wide and various subjects that fall under the Unexplained banner. These include ufology, hauntings, disasters and all sorts of other paranormal phenomena, including true crime, unsolved crime, serial killers, the darker side of some past celebrities and the occasional missing person that often goes unnoticed. So if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review or an opinion of this episode's subject that I can reply to, a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. Or if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. And lastly, if you get a few minutes, perhaps you might want to check out my social media groups and pages, including Facebook, Instagram and TikTok, which are filled daily with all sorts of unexplained and crime stuff. I'll put the links to some of my socials in the description. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about the up, down and inside-out world of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. And this week's necessary disclaimer. This story is a tale that sadly involves the mistreatment of mental health patients and even death, so may prove upsetting to some. You listen at your own discretion. Also, all opinions and comments are strictly my own, but the facts of the case remain. I also apologise if I pronounce anything incorrectly. My English, although it is my first and only language, the other day I got fired from my job as a set designer, but it's all okay because I left without making a scene. But anyway, let us get back to the story. Well, according to Wikipedia, Weston itself is a city and county seat of the Lewis County, West Virginia in the United States, with a population of 3,943 as declared at the 2020 census. It was originally founded in 1818 under the name of Preston and then changed its name to Flesherville soon after, and then finally to Weston in 1819, just a year later. Not only is Weston home to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, but it is also home to the Museum of American Glass in West Virginia. Weston's other notable buildings are the National Register of Historic Places and the former Weston Coloured School, which is a genealogical and historical library and museum. The city itself also has two National Historic Districts. These are the Weston Downtown District and I'm going to do that one again. These are the Weston Downtown Historic District and the Weston Downtown Residential Historic District. I got there. Amongst Weston's many notable people are the musician Buddy Hayes, the World War II USAAF pilot Charlie Brown, and the football player Fred Wyant. So, before I get into the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum story itself, let's have a look at a potted history behind lunatic asylums in general. Well, according to Google, the phrase lunatic asylum was popularised by the US film producer called Richard A. Rowland, who used it when he reacted in 1919 to the establishment of the United Artists Corporation, which allowed actors to control their own interests independently from commercial studios. And according to Wikipedia, again, the lunatic asylum, or otherwise known as an insane asylum or mental asylum, was originally an institution where people with mental illness were confined, with it being an early precursor of the modern psychiatric hospital. The treatment of inmates in most of the early lunatic asylums was somewhat brutal, with the main focus being on containment and restraint. However, the discovery of antipsychotic and mood-stabilising drugs much later resulted in a shift in focus from the containment of inmates in lunatic asylums to the treatment of patients in psychiatric hospitals. And later still, there was a further and more thorough critique in the form of the deinstitutionalisation movement, which focused on treatment from home or in a less isolated institution, and over time the old lunatic asylums were eventually replaced by the more modern psychiatric hospitals. Today, the modern psychiatric hospital, which is also known as a mental health hospital, a behavioural health hospital, or simply just an asylum, is a specialised medical facility that focuses on the treatment of several mental disorders, catering for conditions such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, and eating disorders, among others. Construction began on the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which was authorised by the Virginia General Assembly in late 1858 and was initially conducted by prison labourers, with most of the building materials being sourced locally. And because the building materials also consisted of blue sandstone, from a quarry in Mount Clair in West Virginia, skilled stonemasons from Germany and Ireland were also employed. In 1861, the construction of the building was interrupted by the outbreak of American Civil War, and following the succession of the state of Virginia from the United States, the government demanded the return of the hospital's unused construction funds for its defence. And in 1862, the funding was seized from the established treasury so the hospital could continue with its construction. And following the admission of West Virginia as a US state in 1863, the hospital itself was renamed the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane. Yeah, guys, that's real subtle. The first patients who were admitted into the hospital, whilst it was still under construction, was in the October of 1864. The hospital's 200-foot central clock tower was completed in 1871, and separate rooms for black people were completed in 1873, and with the hospital intending to be self-sufficient, which included things like a farm, a dairy, a waterworks and a cemetery located on its grounds, its construction continued right up until 1881. After this first short break, in part 2, we will look at the continuing history regarding the building's construction and the type of patients it was admitting.
This show is brought to you courtesy of Neil Packer and the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre. Find them online at www.hauntedresearchcentre.com or at 9 to 11 Regent Street, Hinckley, LE10 1AW. Open on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for guided tours of the haunted rooms at just £3 per person. Booking is essential at all times, and over 16s only, please, unless accompanied by an adult. The haunted rooms are extremely haunted, and paranormal activity could, and has, taken place at any time. Some areas and particular objects or items can be quite scary and unnerving. Membership is available for £25 to qualify for selective offers. And why not download the app, available on both iOS and Android, for only $3.99, to keep up to date with what is coming up at the centre.
Patients were admitted to the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum for a variety of reasons, which included asthma, laziness, egotism, domestic troubles and even greediness, which led to an overwhelming number of patients being admitted, which in turn caused the asylum to face an unbelievably drastic shortage of both beds and staff. The asylum was originally designed to house 250 patients, all in solitude, but by 1880 the hospital was holding 717 patients, and in 1938 it was housing 1,661, climbing to 1,800 in 1949, but it was at its peak in the 1950s when it hit the grand total of 2,600 patients in what was now considered overcrowded conditions. In 1881, due to the increase in mental health diagnosis along with the stigma surrounding the disease, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum found its facilities overrun when suddenly faced the demand for housing an extra 500 patients, which is more than they had ever imagined. So, with this staff being unable to cope or keep up with the unforeseen demand and rise in the number of casualties arriving, which continue to grow each and every day, so the conditions began to rapidly decline. This dwindling care would first show by patients being crammed together, with sometimes up to 4 or 5 of them in a room that was just intended for one. Then the dairy farm on the compound, which was originally intended to meet the needs of 300 patients, was unable to meet the demand that came with the overcrowding. And to top it all, some of the patients began to starve, which only contributed to their already declining mental health. As I briefly mentioned earlier, by 1938, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was over 6 times its capacity, housing at least 1,661 patients, with these patients inside the building not only running wild and out of control, but they were also unable to be controlled by the orderlies. So, again in 1938, a report was done by a survey committee that was organised by a group of North American medical organisations who found that at the time the hospital was housing epileptics, alcoholics, drug addicts and mental defectives, meaning people who were found to be incapable of being educated, amongst its population. It was also reported by the same survey committee that due to the lack of proper care and access to sanitation at the asylum, this then led to a large number of deaths. And while the official count of patients who have died at the hospital are not available, whilst researching for this podcast, an investigation is currently underway to determine an accurate count, with the hospital expert and historian Titus Swan estimating that the death toll could well be in or above the 5-figure range. At its peak in the 1950s, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was holding nearly 2,600 patients, which was much more than 10 times its original intention. To expose the horrendous conditions within the hospital, a series of reports by the Charleston Gazette had been given the authority to investigate, but not only did they find that the site had poor sanitation along with insufficient furniture, lighting and heating in much of the complex, they also found that most of the patients were sleeping on the floor in freezing rooms due to a lack of furniture and heat. There were overworked staff, all with a decreased emphasis on the level of sanitation, mainly due to the overcrowding at the site. The once bright, clear windows were now covered with grime, which were now darkening and further chilling the rooms even more, and the wallpaper was peeling from the decaying walls, where it had just either disintegrated on its own, or the patients had torn it off in rages of anger or frustration. However, the report didn't just stop there. Oh no, because according to the orderlies, what was even worse than the hospital building itself was the patients themselves, as some of them, mainly the ones whom the orderlies deemed unable to be controlled, had been locked in cages in open areas in a desperate attempt to make more bedroom spaces available for the less worrisome ones. In the early 1950s, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, although it was known as Weston State Hospital at that time, found itself to be the home for the West Virginia lobotomy project. This idea was an effort by the state of West Virginia and the American physician Walter Freeman to use lobotomy to help reduce the number of patients in asylums, simply because there was severe overcrowding. On an interesting side note, a lobotomy, or otherwise known as a leucotomy, is a discredited form of neurosurgical treatment for a psychiatric or neurological disorder, meaning things like epilepsy or depression, that involves severing connections in the brain's prefrontal cortex, with the surgery causing most of the connections to and from the prefrontal cortex and the anterior part of the frontal lobes of the brain to be severed. In the past, and in some countries, this treatment was used for handling psychiatric disorders as a mainstream procedure, with the procedure being controversial from its initial use, and some doctors claiming that it was an inappropriate treatment, mainly in part due to a lack of recognition of the severity and chronicity of severe and enduring psychiatric illness. After the procedure was modified and championed by the American physician Walter Freeman, who performed the first lobotomy at a mental hospital in the United States in 1936, the use of the procedure increased dramatically from the early 1940s and into the 1950s. And by 1951, almost 20,000 lobotomies had been performed in the US, and proportionally more in the United Kingdom, with more lobotomies being performed on women than on men, finding, again in 1951, that nearly 60% of American lobotomy patients were female. From the 1950s onward, the lobotomy began to be abandoned, first in the Soviet Union, where the procedure immediately garnered extensive criticism and was not widely employed, before being banned in the rest of Europe. However, derivatives of it, such as the stereotactic tracheotomy and a bilateral cingulotomy, are still used. The originator of the lobotomy procedure, a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz, shared the Nobel Prize for the Physiology of Medicine in 1949 for the, and I quote,
discovery of the therapeutic value of leucotomy in certain psychoses.
Although the awarding of the prize has been subjected to much controversy. By the 1980s, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, due to changes in the treatment of mental illness at the time, had managed to reduce its patient population. However, this didn't stop the orderlies from still locking the patients that they couldn't control in cages. In the February of 1986, the then Governor, Arch Moore, who was also an American lawyer and Republican politician, announced plans to build a new psychiatric facility elsewhere in the state and convert the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, meaning the Weston Hospital as it was called back then, into a prison. However, just as Arch Moore authorised the work to begin on the prison conversion, the state found the move to be unconstitutional, and so the work was then suspended, and instead a new facility called the William R. Sharp Jr. Hospital was built, and the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, again meaning the Weston Hospital, was finally closed in the May of 1994. The hospital's closure mainly came about due in part to a class action lawsuit that was filed by some of the family members of some of the patients, and due to the article about the poor sanitation of the hospital and the horrific treatment of its patients that was reported way back in the early 1950s by the Charleston Gazette. And since its closure in the May of 1994, after more than 100 years of squalor, foulness and filth, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum finally closed its doors forever, and the building and its grounds have since been mostly vacant apart from the odd local event, which included such things as fairs, church revivals and tours. And on a last note, just before we go into part 3 of the show, by the time the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum would close its doors in the May of 1994, the graveyard that belonged to the hospital at the time had been expanded from its original size to an airy 666 acres in order that it could make room for more rapidly dying patients. And just to give you some idea of how big that is, the average size football field is about 1.32 acres. After this second short break, in part 3 we will look at a little more history regarding the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, what the building is being used for now, and for all you budding ghost hunters out there, a look at some of the spirits that have been reported around the development.
Fright Nights was established in 1999 as the first company in the world to offer overnight ghost hunt experiences to the general public, pioneering paranormal events since the last century. Fright Nights operate at hundreds of the UK's most haunted and exclusive venues. All events have their own team of experienced paranormal investigators, mediums and psychics. They have a VIP members club for regular returning guests, offering loyalty discounts and exclusive invitation-only events. They can also host private events for your family and friends. You can contact them on 07852 998 628 or email them at office@frightnights.co.uk, or take a look at their website at www.frightnights.co.uk, where you can see the many locations they investigate and learn about them and the opportunities they have available. Hundreds of ghost hunters join Fright Nights every month for the most thrilling ghost hunting experiences they'll never forget. If you haven't been on a ghost hunt before, then why not join them to see what it's all about? Why not visit their social media sites for up-to-date information on all the places they visit and to see what's coming up in the future? They look forward to seeing you all soon. Fright Nights Ghost Hunting Events. Remember, only the original will do.
In 1999, all 4 floors of the interior of the empty building were damaged by several off-duty city, county and state police officers whilst playing paintball. However, once they were discovered, 3 of the officers were immediately dismissed. Efforts towards an adaptive reuse of the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum's empty shell have included proposals to convert the building into a Civil War museum, a hotel or a golf course complex, and in the year 2000 a non-profit organisation called the Weston Hospital Revitalisation Committee was formed for the purpose of aiding the preservation of the building and finding appropriate tenants. Then the structure, which was once the ornate building intended for healing but destined for destruction, sat abandoned, lonely, empty and neglected, with no one to love it, as if all its patients had just disappeared into thin air, with its rooms still filled with medical equipment, decrepit furniture and wheelchairs still sitting in its hallways. Sigh. In 2004, the 3 small museums that were devoted to military history, toys and mental health were opened on the first floor of the main hospital building. However, they were soon forced to close due to fire code violations. On the 29th of August in 2007, the hospital was auctioned by the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources, with a Mr. Joe Jordan, who was an asbestos demolition contractor from Morgantown, being the highest bidder, paying $1.5 million for the 242,000 square foot structure. And in the October of 2007, a full fest was held at the old empty hospital building. Since 2007, tours of the building have been made available for those who wish to experience the full horror of the hospital firsthand. The main building of the asylum, which is now known as the Kirkbride, holds several rooms that serve as the museum that is located on the first floor. And on display in this room are paintings, poems and drawings made by patients who were in the art therapy programs of the time. There is also a room dedicated to the different medical treatments and restraints used in the past, along with artefacts such as a straitjacket and hydrotherapy tub. On an interesting side note here, the straitjacket, and of course I'm more than aware that you all know what one is, but I thought this was kind of interesting anyway. The straitjacket is a garment shaped like a jacket with long sleeves that surpass the tips of the wearer's fingers, with its most typical use in restraining people who may cause harm to themselves or others. Once the wearer's arms are in the sleeves, the person restraining the wearer crosses the sleeves against the chest and ties the ends of the sleeves to the back of the jacket, ensuring the arms are close to the chest with as little movement as possible. Other names for the straitjacket are camisoles or straight waistcoats. The original use for the straitjacket comes from the Georgian era of medicine, with physical restraint being used both as a treatment for mental illness and to pacify patients in understaffed asylums, with canvas and duck cloth, due to its strength, being the most common materials for institutional use. The effect of a straitjacket as a restraint also makes it of special interest in escapology and as a staple prop in stage magic. The guides themselves, whilst conducting the tours around the building, dress in clothes that resemble the 19th century nurse outfits, wearing blue dresses, white aprons, white caps and white shoes. The shorter historical tour offer allows visitors to see the first floor of the aforementioned Kirkbride, while the longer historical tour allows visitors to see all 4 floors, the apartments of the staff and the morgue, along with the operating theatre. But aside from the building's historical tours, like me, you would be pleased to know that there are also 2 paranormal tours, with both starting as the sun sets, with the shorter tour lasting about 2 to 3 hours, and the longer tour being overnight, with the added option, or bonus even, of having another private tour. Well, I know which one I'll be going on. But I digress. According to most of the guests who have taken their haunted tours around the old building, the presence of the 100 or so patients who perished in the terrible conditions of the hospital can still be felt in the hallways, with some visitors reporting sights of seeing ghostly apparitions walking through the hallways at night and balls of light, otherwise known as orbs, floating through the air. Probably the most famous spirit in the hospital is the one named Lily, or nicknamed Little Lily, with her story going something like this. It all started with a woman named Gladys, Lily's mother, who was originally sent to the asylum when she was supposedly raped by Civil War soldiers, and that when she was admitted to the hospital, she suddenly found out that she was pregnant. During childbirth, Gladys passed away, which unfortunately left the newborn on her own, so the nurses in the ward, who ultimately took to the little girl, named her Lily. And, again, according to the legend, little Lily only had one home, and that was just for a very short period of time. But not only that, when she was 9 years old, she then contracted pneumonia, which ultimately killed her. Little Lily's room is located on the 4th floor of the building and is currently filled with toys, plush animals and candy, all of which people like to bring her, as if she's waiting for someone to play with. It has also been reported that the dolls and various other toys move on their own, the candy disappears, and a music box randomly turns on. Another popular set of spirits that are said to haunt the hospital are the ghosts of Dean, Big Jim and David Mason, with their stories going something like this. Big Jim and David Mason were brutal murderers who were both not only criminally insane, but they were also included in the asylum's top 10 most dangerous men, which, if you ask me, isn't a good look to have on your CV. From all accounts, it appears that both of these men brutally murdered this Dean, first by hanging him, which was unsuccessful, and then by forcing his head down under the bedpost, followed by both of the men then repeatedly jumping onto the bed, ultimately killing him, because, yes, that would probably do it. Dean is known to be a quiet spirit who has spoken a few times, but any time the shadows of Big Jim and David Mason come around, he seems to then vanish. But not only that, it has been reported that when these two shadows show up, meaning Big Jim and David Mason of course, the energy in the room changes, which causes some people to feel ill and uncomfortable. Some of the other spirits that are said to haunt the building are a spirit named Slewfoot, who supposedly killed and tortured people in the upstairs bathroom, and to this day still haunts the bathroom and the upstairs floor. The spirit of a female patient named Ruth, who resided in the Civil War wing with the veterans, and according to her legend, hated men with unbelievable rage, and still to this day will throw things at them if she is given the chance. The spirit of Nurse Elizabeth, who it is said originally went from floor to floor taking care of the patients in need, and has still been reported to roam the halls with the other ex-residents of the hospital. And last, but by no means least, the spirit called James, who is said to have died from a heart attack in one of the upstairs bathtubs. Perhaps the water was too cold. Sorry, that's my dark sense of humour creeping through there. While some sceptics will probably always deny the paranormal rumours surrounding the building, or indeed most places, I think there is still one thing that we can all agree on, and that is that the Trans-Allegheny, what is it called? Allegheny. I know I've got it wrong a few times. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum will always be representative or a reminder of the dark and shameful past of how we treated fellow human beings, and that it is also an urgent call to treat people better in the future.
Thank you all for taking the time out to listen to this episode of Mark's Unexplained World. In our next episode, show number 154, we are going to be looking at the Maury Island UFO. The Maury Island UFO incident refers to claims made by two men following sightings of unidentified flying objects in the sky over Maury Island, Washington, in the United States, with the pair claiming that the events had occurred on the 21st of June in 1947. On the 1st of August, later that same year, 2 Air Force officers who were tasked with investigating the incident were killed when their plane crashed outside of Kelso in Washington. Project Blue Book chief Edward J. Ruppelt characterised the Maury Island UFO story as, and I quote, the dirtiest hoax in the UFO history.
This show was written and researched by myself, Mark Hughes, and proofread and edited by Linda Hughes. The pronunciations of all the names, especially Allegheny, was all mine. The actors in this episode were Mark Hughes, Linda Hughes and Denise Poolar, with special thanks for Neil Packer and the staff at the Haunted Antiques Paranormal Research Centre in Hinckley. And of course a big thank you to everyone for listening. We never run out of ideas here at the office for Mark's Unexplained World podcast, but if you know of any other intriguing stories under the Unexplained banner, including ufology, hauntings, disasters and any other sort of paranormal phenomena, as well as true crime on soul crime and missing people, just drop me a direct message and I'll see what I can do. I'll also include the name of the person who suggested the idea in the end credits of the podcast, if they're happy for me to do so, of course. And again, just to add, if you are listening to this show on YouTube, please give us a review and a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you are listening on any of the other podcast platforms, again, give us a like and a follow. I thank you in advance. Mark's Unexplained World, because there's more to the paranormal than meets the third eye. And remember, guys, keep it real, because being real is better than being perfect. No AI was used or harmed in the making of this or any other episode of Mark's Unexplained World. This show and all its contents are covered by basic copyright of Mark the Medium.